So, in every debate tournament, in any style, there is a resolution. And what a resolution is basically the topic that you'll be debating about during the course of the tournament. The first tournament you're going to engage in is just against like people within this class. So that means you're just debating against other people in the class, you're not debating against anyone else. The resolution for that tournament is resolved, sugary drinks should not be sold in primary and secondary schools. So that's the first tournament you're debating in. The second tournament, which is the international online tournament, which happens towards the end of the semester, that resolution is resolved, the United Nations should adopt a resolution decrying or demanding an end to the annual dolphin hunt in Taiji, Japan. First question on the quiz is, what are the resolutions you'll be debating? You need to know both these resolutions, alright? And the way that quiz question is graded is literally, you lose a point for every word that you have inaccurate. So, memorize these two resolutions, because the first question on the quiz is, what are the two resolutions? These are the two resolutions. The reason why it's the first question on the quiz is because for you to be able to debate, you need to know what you're debating about. Make sense? Alright. Now, on every debate, there are two sides. There's what's known as an affirmative side, which is also known as a proposition side, and a negative side, which is oftentimes referred to as an opposition side. So you'll hear in the debate tournaments people refer to you as aff or neg, that's affirmative or negative, or you'll hear them refer to you as prop or op, that's proposition or opposition. So either of them are the same, like negative and opposition is the same, affirmative and proposition are the same. The affirmative side / the proposition team says yes to the resolution, and then the negative side or the opposition says no to the resolution. That's generally how it breaks down. In every debate tournament, you will take on both sides. That's sort of known as switch side debating, so that way you have to learn and debate both sides of any given topic. And so you will be affirmative and negative, which means that you're going to be both proposition and opposition. Now, what affirmatives generally do is they don't just say, yes, sugary drinks should not be sold in primary schools, or yes, the UN should adopt a resolution. Normally they come up with a specific plan. And that's what's known as policy debating, is when there is a specific plan of action that's attached to it. So when debating that first resolution, you could actually propose a piece of federal legislation that would phase out sugary drinks within primary and secondary schools, and then through subsidies allow for more healthy initiatives within schools. Or you could have it be implemented on the state level. Or you could say the schools should ban it for themselves and should not sell sugary drinks within the school. So in a policy debate style, you can actually pick a specific policy for how that resolution would be realized. Same thing with the resolution for the United Nations should adopt a resolution decrying or demanding an end to the annual dolphin hunt. There, you can have a resolution that the UN could actually enact that could have teeth to it, that if Japan does not stop the dolphin hunt, that trade sanctions or other forms of sanction will actually be enforced upon Japan, which means that you could have different ways of actually talking about it, that you could actually have a specific policy that you could then defend as what you're doing, and that makes it easier because then you're only defending something very small. Alright? Now, when you affirm, you also could do it outside of a policy context. So you don't necessarily need to have a specific plan. And that's what's known as value debating. And so you could affirm the resolution by saying sugar drinks should not be sold in primary and secondary schools from a moral stance, as if this is a question of what we should or should not do, not is it legislatively desirable or not desirable. Should the UN implement a resolution saying Japan should stop the dolphin hunt? Could be a abstracted question that's based upon values and does not necessarily have to be based upon specific policy implementations. And so one of the things that you do in your first proposition speech is you explain how exactly you're going to affirm the resolution. And so you could affirm it again through a policy where you pick a specific proposal, or you could affirm the abstract as a value. Now, when you look at sugar drinks should not be sold in primary schools for this first tournament, there are state policies and local governmental policies that have been implemented where sugar drinks have been banned in schools. So you could find a specific initiative and say that we should enforce that initiative across the nation and then defend that initiative. So that way you don't have to defend everything in abstract. You're defending a specific initiative and not any initiative that could be implemented. Or if you don't like that, you could just be It's important to ban these drinks in a more value-based sense because of the way that Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola fuels money into primary, secondary schools that allow corporations to control the way that education takes place. And so it's a more of a moral stance than it is defending an individual policy. Does that make sense to people? That there's two different ways you could approach affirming the resolution. Not only is there those two different ways, that within each of those, both policy and value-based, there are many different ways you can do it within there, right? Like I mentioned, like there are specific governmental initiatives that you can implement for sugar-easy drinks. That's one of any number of legislative policies you can enforce. It also allows you to pick the actor. Should it be the state? Should it be the federal government? Should it be the schools, etc.? So that means you can actually have a debate over what actor is the best one to implement that resolution within a policy sense. Within a value sense, it comes down to you could have it values based upon utilitarianism, right? Whoever is for the greatest good, or values based upon deontology, which whoever is more morally righteous or anything along those lines for the best for the individual that's needed. And so you pick how you want to affirm the resolution. The negative is actually responsible not for really just saying no to the resolution, but saying no to the affirmative team. Which means that when you're the opposition team in these online debate rounds, you have to come up with a reason for why the affirmative should be rejected, and not just a reason for why the resolution is bad in a general sense. Right? So you need to have specific arguments that respond to it. Which means that the negative, for instance, while there's a resolution so you know what you're debating about, it also sort of creates a situation where the negative has a lot of different things that they have to be ready and be prepared to debate against, and the affirmative gets to pick the ground that they actually want to defend and debate. Does that make sense to people? And so one of the things as an affirmative you do is you try and pick a small ground that you're comfortable and you want to defend as a reason, and then the negative has to come to you in order to debate that. Yeah?
What if we're debating against, and we're saying, and maybe the guy who's saying, like, we should do this,
Mm-hmm.
does, like, I don't know, will you know if they're true facts? Like, if they could actually work, can we just say anything?
Well, you could say anything, but ideally you have facts to back it up. And so, in the online format, which is the format that you're doing here, when you upload your video, there's also a space for you to insert any citations that you have. And so it's strongly recommended that you insert your citations, so that way the judge and your opponent can look at those citations, and then you make reference in your speech. A Washington Post article states, and then you can paraphrase. Some people in debate will actually quote, long portions or a couple of key sentences of it, so that way people hear the impact. Other people will paraphrase and give a link. And something that is a matter of debate is what is better evidence and what is bad evidence. Like what evidence should be preferred within a debate round. So one of the things that you should do is compare sources within a debate round. Be like, my source is better than your source because, and there's no right or wrong answer to what source is better. It's all open for debate. And that's one of the things about debate is that essentially everything about it is debatable. So while these are the resolutions, there is nothing to stop someone in their first speech from talking about why we should give the land back to Native Americans and that we should put the focus on that and that's more important than talking about these things. And then that's their speech. And then as a negative, you have to respond to that. And one of the responses you could have is being like, we were prepared to debate the resolution. Not debating about the resolution essentially is unfair and is cheating and you should lose because of that. And then essentially could be a debate about whether the enforcement of that rule is a good one or is it not a good one. In the policy debate community, there's many people who don't actually debate about the resolution specifically, but will debate about race relations within the debate community, or stolen land from indigenous, or speciesism, or various other things that they think is more important to be talking about than the policy, than what the policy community has chosen. And sometimes they'll lose rounds on, you violated the rules and that was bad, but sometimes they'll win that those rules are bad rules to have. And so everything within debate is debatable, and 95% of the people will just affirm the resolution normally, but some people might not. Some people might affirm it ironically. Some people might affirm it through any other numbers of different ways to go about doing it. So this lecture is also more set up as sort of, these are the conventions and norms, but you're able to play with them in any way that you would find justifiable and that you could defend in a speech, essentially. And all you have to do is convince the judge that what you did was worth being voted for in the end. Evidence is one of the ways that you help build up your case for reasons for why you should be voted for by research that is, qualified and that makes the arguments you want to make. But someone who's just smart and is able to attack that evidence, sometimes evidence doesn't always win the round because sometimes somebody has a better response to it that's analytic. So you should be able to rely on your own minds as much as you should also rely on evidence. Okay? So, there's a concept known as fiat, and the quiz question is, what is fiat? Alright? And what fiat is, it is the tool that makes the judge believe that if they vote for the proposition team, that what they were saying would actually come into existence. Alright? So if I'm advocating a policy where the UN would enforce sanctions against Japan if they don't end the dolphin hunt, the assumption is that if the judge votes for me, that we are now debating about a world after that policy is implemented. And an argument the negative team is not allowed to make is that it's impossible or wouldn't get done. The UN would never do that. The Security Council will veto it. You also, like, if you were going to implement a federal legislation that would ban sugary drinks in schools, you couldn't say that it would get filibustered within the Senate. Well, I mean, you could, I guess, say, because I said everything's debatable, but generally you can't because of the concept of fiat, which allows us to debate about what should be done and not what can be done. And so that's sort of the big development that happened in debate, is that beforehand people would propose plans and then other people would respond, oh, it would just get filibustered, or the president wouldn't sign it, and debate became really boring really quick because then it was just what's possible. But it's about what's desirable. So, what ends up happening is that you can debate the idealized world that you would like to debate in, and then you have to defend that, right? So you get to imagine a world where sugary drinks simply are not sold within schools. You get to imagine a world where the UN will implement any resolution that you decide, and fiat is that tool that allows it to actually pass, so that way we get to debating about what happens after that plan is enacted. And in a value-based debate, fiat is not as important because it's not as the issue about whether or not a plan passes or is happening isn't as important about whether or not we should take a stance against something. So fiat is less important in a world where you're going to be advocating for a value and reasons for why we should align ourselves for or against certain things, dolphin hunting or sugary drinks, and more important in a world where you're actually defending policies. Yep.
So fiat would only be taken into account after the affirmative side presents a policy, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is when the affirmative presents a policy, it's the assumption that to get that policy enacted, so then we can debate about whether or not that policy takes place. So the right quiz answer is anything along the lines of the belief that when the judge votes affirmative or for the proposition team, that their idea will be implemented or that their plan will actually pass. So we can debate about what should happen and not just what can happen. Okay? Any questions? Alright, so in your first proposition speech, there's a couple of things that you generally need to establish. And the quiz question is, what are the shits? And you have to be able to know what each one of these letters of the acronym stand for, and then what it means. And so the I in the shits stands for inherency. And inherency is the argument that sort of describes the status quo and shows that what you're advocating for isn't already happening, right? Because if you're just advocating for something that already exists in the status quo, then you're not really advocating for anything. So, like, you have to show, for instance, that sugary drinks are in schools and there's nothing stopping sugary drinks from being sold in schools. You have to show that right now the UN has no resolution that is working stopping the dolphin hunt in Japan. Most resolutions are set up so that way it's very clear. There is no UN resolutions that are stopping the dolphin hunt in Japan. It's going on right now. There's nothing stopping sugary drinks being sold in schools because it's going on right now, which means the plan is inherent. It's not already in existence. So you give a reason for why you're different than what the status quo already is, right? If everybody already said we shouldn't have sugary drinks in schools, that would not be a good value debate because everyone already agrees with you. So you have to show that a bunch of people don't agree with that, and that's why it's important for the judge to vote for you, because that stance is an important value to uphold to help shift the community to change the way that they approach issues of sugary drinks, right? And so you need to show that your plan is inherent, that it's not already existing in the status quo, right? So you're expected to be able to say inherency and give like just a quick definition of what inherency is, all right? The H stands for harms. And what harms are is what is really bad about the status quo. Why is it bad to have sugary drinks in schools? What's the harm of that? What's the harm of the dolphin hunt that's going on currently? And there's millions of different harms that you could have, right? For the dolphin hunt, you could say it's unethical to kill dolphins because of their sentience, and so it's anthropocentric in species and it should be rejected on moral principles. You could say that it is bad for the ocean ecology because when the hunt takes place, they do all sorts of things that hurt the coastal areas and hurt the oceans, and if the oceans get hurt, that would be really bad. They also use the dead dolphins for dolphin meat in schools in Japan, and there's a high level of radioactivity within it, and so that's another harm that exists within the dolphin hunt and things like that. You could also, for instance, a harm of the status quo. One of the things that people say is that the UN doesn't have credibility right now, that the UN is not a strong enough institution. So maybe if the UN took action against this dolphin hunt, they might be able to shore up their credibility and become a stronger institution. So you have a harm that's based upon the crumbling of the United Nations, and then the plan, being able to take this stance, will help solidify the strength of the United Nations. So there's different types of harms that you could be able to create. Sugary drinks, you have obesity issues, you have attention issues, you have monetary issues, you have a bunch of different issues that are all bound up within there, and you sort of pick the harms or the impacts of why it's important to vote for the affirmative, right? If you can't prove that what you're trying to change is bad, then we shouldn't change it, right? So you have to prove a harm to the status quo and a reason for why it's bad. So definition of harms is just what is wrong with the status quo, what is really bad, why is it important to vote affirmative, is essentially all those are sort of acceptable definitions. And when you are the proposition team, you get to pick what harms you want to talk about, right? So if you're not interested in talking about speciesism and why we shouldn't hurt dolphins, but you are interested in the United Nations, you can talk almost entirely about the United Nations, and the dolphin issue could be a footnote. But if you don't care at all about the United Nations, but you're really into animal rights, then talk about speciesism. If you like some sort of mix in between, you could have more than one harm within your affirmative speech. You could just pick which harms you want to actually emphasize. And so you pick the ground that you want to debate on and what harms you're going to then be talking about. Right? I also does for solvency. And what solvency is evidence or the argument that if the judge votes affirmative, you'd actually be able to solve the problem. So Fiat gets your plan to pass, but doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work, right? So if you're saying that we need to remove sugary drinks from schools because it's causing obesity and so we shouldn't sell them in schools, well, you would have to prove that doing that would actually solve children from drinking sugary drinks. There's nothing to stop them from bringing it from home or going across the street to 7-Eleven and then buying it and then bringing it onto the school property, right? So you might not be able to solve for your harm of child obesity if you just ban sugary drinks from schools. So you have to prove, essentially, that you could solve for the harms, right? And so all this, to me, intuitively makes sense. You have to prove you're not the status quo, the inherency, that something is wrong with the status quo, your harms, and that by voting for affirmative, you could solve your harms, right? And in a value debate, it's the same sort of thing, is that it is important for us to take a stance against slaughtering dolphins from a moral positioning. Right, the solvency comes from advocating for things and taking a strong stance against things that are morally reprehensible is valuable because it creates a social statement to help move society and educational initiatives into a positive direction, right? So it's a different type of solvency. It's not like this policy will be able to do X, Y, and Z and that'll solve, but that your speech actually matters and does something, all right? So, definition of solvency, proof that it can actually take care of the harms, that voting affirmative will be able to solve the problems that are ongoing in the status quo, anything along those lines. Okay? The other S stands for significance. And what significance is just essentially that. A dictionary definition of the word significant would get you the full credit on this quiz grade. And it's just that you have solved to a substantial degree the problems that you're mentioning. So it's not that you stop one kid from getting sugary beverages in the school and that's enough, right? You have to solve for a significant amount of kid getting sugary beverages for it to really matter, right? Or you have to prove that you're doing more than just a single, like you're solving more than one dolphin. But you can also say one dolphin or one kid not getting sugary drinks is significant from a moral stance as well. So essentially you just have to prove that what you're doing is substantial in effect, that it has a big impact, and that it's meaningful to be done, right? So you have to show that your harm is not meaningless, and then voting affirmative can actually do something. And the T stands for topic, that you're topical or topicality. And so that's proving that what you're doing is that you're on topic, that you're responsive, and you're talking about what these resolutions have to do. And so sometimes people actually define key terms within the resolution within their first speech. What is a primary and secondary school? Primary schools are generally considered K through 8, and secondary schools are generally considered 9 through 12. But you can find obscure definitions of primary and secondary schools that can include pre-K, or can include like apprenticeship programs, or it can include undergraduate programs, and all different types of things. So you have to prove that you're on topic and are affirming just what the resolution says, nothing more, nothing less. And so you do that by sort of defining terms. What is a UN resolution? What does it mean to decry the annual dolphin hunt? Is it just a resolution that says we're against the dolphin hunt? Would that be enough, or do you need to have something more than that? So you have to prove that you affirm, or that you're on topic, that you affirm the resolution. And that's what you would do essentially in your first speech. And so the quiz question is, what are the shits and what do they stand for? You're supposed to be able to write these 5 words down and give a sentence definition for each of them. Alright? Any questions on those?
What was the last one again? Topicality.
Topicality. It proves that you're on topic and that you're affirming the resolution. Essentially that you're doing what these things say you should do. Right? And so teams who don't want to do something, that don't want to be topical, instead of saying why they're on topic, they would generally have a portion of that first speech devoted to why this is more important to talking about than the resolution. So they'll sort of start preempting arguments and start saying why it's important to talk about this issue opposed to that issue. But most teams will say, we're doing this because we propose the United Nations should, implement sanctions against Japan unless they bring an end to the dolphin hunt within the next 48 hours or whatever, along those lines. Yeah.
These are the old topics. We haven't found out the new ones.
These are the topics for this year that you'll be debating.
Oh, okay.
First one will be the topic that you'll debate within the class, and then the second one's the topic that you're debating internationally. Okay. Yeah.
You were talking about like somebody is judging it. Are you the judge, or is it like the class?
I will judge some,
Okay.
but at the international one, I will not judge. I can't judge any of you. And so judges are other people, other coaches, other instructors within the debate community, or people who are entering it. So a lot of times there's an instructor who will then enter a whole bunch of people in their class, and they'll then enter as a judge as well. For the international one, sometimes we get activists or government officials or experts in the field or stuff like that. So it's people with bachelor's or above. On the online system, when you are paired, you can actually click the judge's name and it'll take you to their profile, and most of them have entered a short philosophy that sort of gives you a background on how they approach debate and how they'll judge the round. And some will care about some things more than others. Some will be like, I care very much about a policy initiative and how it's going to be enforced. Other people will say, I don't care at all about policies, and I want to hear the quality of your ability to speak about the essential parts of it. And so you should, modify what you would do based upon the judge philosophy. And a lot of times, what people last year did is that they would also Google the name of the person who is judging, and sometimes they were a professor somewhere, and then they would be able to see, this is what they've published on, this is what they're interested on, let me see how I can pitch my arguments in a way that they would like. So you have to adapt to the judge, but you might not always, some judges only write like 2 sentences, some judges will write like 10 paragraphs, so it's worth checking, but it's also like, all the judges will have the basic belief that they will vote for whoever does the better job debating, and won't vote on their opinions, so you shouldn't just say things that you don't entirely agree with just because they happen to be on that side. You should remain true to yourself, but know that sometimes it's easier to get certain people by, doing what they want to hear versus not. So you have to balance those 2 issues. Other questions? Okay. So then the next quiz question, which is important, is what is the order of speeches and time limits? Alright. The first speech is known as, in the outline format, is the opening proposition speech. And that speech is 4 minutes long. Okay, so you have 4 minutes to make your first speech. Which means in those 4 minutes, you're supposed to be able to give all of the shit. So within 4 minutes, you have to explain what's going on in the status quo, why that's wrong, what you intend to do that's relevant to the topic, and how that would solve for those problems in a significant way. That's your burden within the first speech. Alright, in later classes I'll give you more details on how to actually give a speech, but that's the first speech and you have 4 minutes to do it. The next is the opening opposition speech. and that's 5 minutes long. And we'll get into talking about what you do in an opposition speech in a little bit. And then comes the proposition rebuttal. That's 3 minutes long. And then it's the opposition's rebuttal and closing speech, which is 4 minutes long. And then the proposition's closing speech, which is 2 minutes long. So, a couple of things that is interesting about this format is one side has 3 speeches and one side has 2 speeches. But, at the same time, it's the equal amount of speaking times that both sides have. So when you're the proposition, you get to frame the debate. You're the first words and the last words of the debate round. But when you're the opposition time, you're able to give 5 minutes of arguments and your opponents only have 3 minutes to respond. And then you have 4 minutes to be able to defend what you said, and your opponents only have 2 minutes to respond. So the opposition side has the advantage of having the better time allocation because they can do more within that amount of time than the proposition can. But the proposition has the advantage of being able to be those last words in the judge's head. In debate, anything that is not answered is considered conceded. Not like, oops, I forgot to answer this, I'll deal with it later, but considered conceded. So if I say the sky has pink and purple polka dots, and you don't answer that argument, then for all intents and purposes, for the rest of the debate, the sky has pink and purple polka dots. That argument doesn't mean I'm going to win the debate round. Probably just not going to get me anywhere in the debate round. But if I say that the dolphin hunt is destroying the ocean ecology and that within the next 10 years the planet will go extinct as a result of this, if you don't answer that argument, now at the end of the debate round I can say we're going to go extinct in 10 years unless you vote affirmative. Right? And so that argument could very easily lose you the debate round. Right? And so that's why the time allocation is so important here, is that you have to be able to, when you're proposition, figure out what needs to get answered in 2 minutes and what you could forget about. And so generally, in the first 2 speeches, and even in sort of like the next 2, you give a bunch of arguments, but in the end, you're only going for 1 or 2 of the arguments. So like in football, you have a lot of different players on the offense, but in the end, you only need 1 player to get the ball into the end zone, right? And so if you only had that 1 player out there, you'd never be able to score the touchdown because they would know where you're going with it. You need to have the other players to serve as distractions. Same sort of deal in debate is that you have a bunch of arguments, and you really want to win on 1 or 2 of them. You're ready to win on any of them, but you only need to win 1 or 2 of them at the end of the debate. And so you sort of have the other ones there as distractions that you could not, that at the end of the debate you could say, this is irrelevant, fine, we don't care about the ocean ecology. We're going just for it's immoral to kill dolphins. I don't care about childhood obesity. I'm going for it causes ADHD and now kids can't pay attention in classes, which is going to hurt education. Right? So you could concede things in the debate round. You could agree with your opponent. You're right. I was wrong. Soda doesn't cause childhood obesity. However, you haven't answered my ADH argument, and now I'm going to go for that one, and that's what's more important. Right? So you could concede and agree with your opponent. And when you argue with your friends and parents and stuff like that, very often you have you laundry list a bunch of reasons for why you're right, and half of the ones that you're saying are not true. They're just bullshit. There's something to say to fill up time, right? Especially if you start numbering 1 and 2 might be true, but then you always give a third one because people like giving number 3. Same deal. It's like in the end, you only need to win 1 of your points, and then you get what you want. In debate, same thing. You need to win an argument by the end of the day, and you utilize these other things to sort of position yourself in a way to be able to win them. All right. And judges will vote on dropped arguments if you tell them they've conceded this argument, and this argument is the most important. This is why it's the most important. And then you explain that, right? And so just because they've conceded an argument doesn't mean you win on that conceded argument. You still have to explain why that argument is important enough to win the round in light of everything else. And that's essentially what a closing speech does, is you pick the argument you're going for and compare it and weigh it to everything else that's going on in the debate round. And so on the proposition side, you have to be a very good strategic thinker about figuring out what you can spend time on and what you can't spend time on. Whereas in the opposition time, you have a lot more time to sort of make maybe not your best arguments, but a second tier of arguments that you go for. But you have to be able to make it in this last speech in a way where the judge remembers those words and not just 2 minutes, and not just the 2 minutes of the proposition side. So that's sort of the order of the speeches. The other thing, and this is a quiz question, it's what can't you do in the rebuttals that you can in the open meetings. And that is, you can't make new arguments. Alright? So you have to present all the arguments you want to use in your first opening speeches. After that, you can only respond to your opponent and utilize the arguments you already have. Alright? So you can't wait for your last closing speech to bring out the big argument that you've never said before and then be like, aha, I win, because then the other team doesn't have a chance to win. And the opposition side can't wait till this last speech to bring out their best arguments, because that would be unfair to the proposition side that only has 2 minutes. So you have to present all of your arguments in these opening speeches. After that, that's when you start interacting your arguments more. Now, in your rebuttals, you are allowed to make new arguments only if it responds to something your opponent said for the first time. So obviously, right, the opposition is going to say some things in this speech that you have not predicted and you haven't prepared for here. So in this proposition rebuttal, you're allowed to make new arguments, but only new arguments that answer those arguments that came out in the opposition speech, because that's your first time being able to do that. So that's sort of the exception to the rule. And if the proposition says a whole bunch of new stuff here in this rebuttal, then this opposition could also say new stuff to be able to respond to that. But ideally, you want to make as few new arguments as possible, because every time you make new arguments, you have less time to develop it, and it's better to give a better developed argument than just sort of a new argument that pops up. So you want to try and explain why, and the best way to take your proposition rebuttal is explain why the things you said in your opening speech is still true in light of everything the opposition has said, and then do that interaction, do that explanation, and then if you need to say anything else, then add those in as well. But you should try and only be responsive with what you've already said, and if you've thought it and have crafted your first opening speech well enough, you should be able to utilize a lot of that. Alright? Does that make sense to people? Yeah?
Are there better strategies, like maybe ask questions like later, present new arguments later in the round, I guess?
Well,
so, like kind of, I don't know, throw them off a little bit? Are there those types of strategies?
well, the thing is, when I say you can't make new arguments, what a new argument is very much also open for debate. Right? And so, if you're a good liar or good at twisting your words, you'll make a great proposition debater, because you could say, in my previous speech, I said blah, 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 and this means ta, 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 and therefore, it answers these arguments that they say here, right? So you can morph your words, and if you do it by sort of being like, I said this means, and then you interpret it the way you want it to mean, and then apply it, then it's not new, right? Because you've just applied the argument, which you're allowed to do. Now, the judge could also say at the end of the debate round, that was clever, but it's new, so I'm not paying attention to it. But you could say that. In fact, you could even follow it up by saying something like, you might think this is a new argument, but it's not, and it's justified because they've said these things, and this is how this argument I've already said, interacts, right? So you can make arguments for why what you're doing is not new. And you can also convince judges that it's simply not new just by morphing your words well. And right, I'm sure you've all been in arguments where by the end of the argument, they're saying the same thing that you've said because they've just slowly, continuously shifted until they're saying something else, right? And so that's not allowed in debate, but if you're good at doing it and no one really notices, that's all that really matters, right? So it depends on how good you're able to make that, because it is a very thin line from what's new or not new. Like, can you reference new evidence and studies in these rebuttal speeches? You probably could if it's building on an argument that you've already made. I already cited a lot of facts for how hunting dolphins is going to destroy the ocean ecology, but then you said something, and so now I've read a new thing about how coral reefs are affected as a result of the hunt. But that's still my ocean ecology argument, but now I've brought in coral reefs opposed to like dragnets and stuff, right? So it's same, sort of, but also different, right? So you want to, if you are unsure if it's new, you have to weigh in your own head the risk of making this new argument versus just using an argument you've already made. All right? Yeah?
And at any point do you kind of point down your argument when such a rule is broken, or is that just mostly for the judges?
No, you should. So for instance, if this opposition team made a bunch of new arguments in their rebuttal and closing speech, and my proposition, I'd be like, the first 2 minutes of their speech are all new, and I shouldn't have to answer it because they did not talk at all about such and such an issue in this previous speech, which is unfair for me to answer. So the only arguments I need to answer are these, right? when the proposition finishes, right, there's not another speech there, so that's really just entirely up to the judge. But anytime somebody does something that like does something new earlier on, you should be like, you should flag that for the judge. And if you have time, it's also not a bad idea to also be able to answer it. Be like, this is a new argument, you shouldn't pay attention to it. Even if you do, it's wrong because blah. And if you give just like a single sentence on it, judges are like, it's probably new and there's an answer, they'll probably give you leeway. So I wouldn't spend a lot of time answering those new arguments, but it's always good at least giving a footnoted answer to it. Alright. Other questions?
And this is taking place over a period of 5 days.
Yes. So like on day 1, you do this speech. On day 2, that speech, so on and so forth. And so you're doing 2 rounds simultaneously and you're switching back and forth between the 2 rounds. Right, so you two might be debating each other with you propping you up, and the next time you'll be the op debating her on the flip side, right? So you're debating 2 different people doing 2 different sides. And so you could, someone might say something really smart in one of these speeches, and you could use it in your other debate if you want, or in your second round and stuff like that. And so you're able to do those things. And in the international tournament, if you continue to qualify for later rounds, you could go and watch your opponent's videos from the previous rounds in order to see what they're doing, so that way you can get an idea of how you could craft your arguments to respond to it as well. Alright. Now, most of that stuff in terms of like strategy and all those sort of things is not on the quiz. It's just sort of stuff that you need to know, as you debate. The quiz questions are: what are the order of the speeches? What are the time limits? What can't you do in the rebuttals and closing speeches you can do in the opening speeches? All right, those are the quiz questions for that portion of this. All right. Any questions on that? Okay, so then on your opening opposition side, there's a couple of different ways that you could attack the proposition team. They break down into 2 categories, known as on case and off case. On-case arguments are where you respond directly to the affirmative team. They say, sugary beverages cause obesity, that's their harm. I say, no it doesn't. You're responding directly to the shits. They say implementing a UN resolution will cause Japan to stop. I will say, no it doesn't, because the UN has tried to do resolutions in the past against whaling and it hasn't stopped them. So you're literally responding to the proposition's case. That's why it's called on case. So it's directly responsive to the shits. You don't solve, you don't have harms, it's not inherent, it's not topical, it's not significant. It's direct responses. Off-case arguments are arguments that are tangentially related, and so that they have something to do with the affirmative, but not a whole lot. And those are what a lot of times oppositions use to win the debate rounds, because if you're just saying, sugary drinks probably don't cause obesity, probably won't do so good, implementing this resolution may not work, well, why not still go ahead and give it a try? Right? You have to come up with a reason for why it's undesirable for the judge to vote for the proposition team, and not just why it might not be perfect. All right? And so normally you use on-case arguments, which are oftentimes defense, just reasons for why they're untrue, and you pair that with an off-case argument, which is a larger piece of offense for why what they're doing is bad. All right. There are 4 different types of off-case arguments. And the quiz question is, what are the 4 different types of off-case arguments? The first type of off-case argument is known as a disadvantage, or a disad, or a DA for short. The definition of a disadvantage is a linear chain of events set in motion by the affirmative plan that causes something bad to happen. A causes B, causes C, and that's bad. So, a linear chain of events set in motion by the affirmative that causes something bad to happen. Alright?
What is the full...
Disadvantage. Disadvantage, disad, diad. And so, one example of a disadvantage that exists is a disadvantage. It could be a spending disadvantage. To implement a policy to ban sugary drinks and enforce it costs money. That might be more money than the government can afford right now, and that would cause a crash in the economy. Or if the government's currently trying to figure out ways to reduce to eliminate student loan debt, but then would have to take that money they would give to student loan forgiveness, and then put it in enforcing the ban on sugary drinks, That's a trade-off dissent. You have taken money that trades off with this other issue. You have spent money, and that will be bad because it'll cause a recession. So, not really related, but a little related. An example of one that goes for the United Nations is that if the United Nations starts adopting resolutions decrying certain cultural practices, even in relation to Japan, then they might start being willing to adopt resolutions against other cultural practices, whether it be female genital surgery or mutilation in Africa, or whether it be Eskimo whaling, or whether it be anything else, that the UN might start taking this as an initiative to trample down other cultural rights. So even if that culturally Japan doesn't need to hunt dolphins because it's not really part of the culture in the way that it's being done now, it doesn't mean that implementing that won't cause the UN to start doing other things that would be bad, which is sort of like a spillover disadvantage. If they do this one thing, it will continue to snowball and spill over into other areas that would be bad. And so now my disadvantage is a reason to reject that affirmative team, not because I want to continue to preserve the dolphin hunt, or not because I want to keep sugary drinks in school, but because the initiative to stop it will cause something else that's really bad to take place, right? So like if the federal government banned sugary drinks in schools, that could be a violation of the separation of powers, federal and state power, and if the federal government is willing to trample state rights on these issues, they could trample state rights in any other issue. Maybe they'll ban all gay marriage and declare it unconstitutional and violate rights in that way. So, again, unrelated to the sugary drink conversation, but if the federal government enlarges its power as a result of the affirmative, and that enlarged federal power is a bad idea because of some other reason, if that reason is bigger than the harms of the affirmative, that means the judge votes for the opposition at the end. Does that make sense to people? Right, it's just an unrelated reason, right? So for instance, you came to class today because you wanted to get a good grade. The harm of not showing up here was you could get a bad grade, right? So you came, you saw it because you're getting that information. A dissad to coming here is that you could have died on the way, right? And so then the question is, does dying outweigh good grade, right? In this instance, you said no. Dying did not outweigh good grade. Good grade is more important. But obviously, right, you're doing a probability assessment too, right? What is the probability of me dying getting to campus versus the probability of me getting a bad grade on the quiz if I don't show up, right? And so it's always weighing those two things. And in debate round, nobody wins 100% of their argument. So it's always sort of a question of probability times magnitude. How big is the impact? You dying is probably worse than a bad grade. But the probability of you dying is much smaller than a bad grade, right? So it's better for that probability, right? If I told you aliens will kill you as soon as you leave this door, you're probably still going to go home tonight, even though that magnitude is really big because the probability is really small. And there's a larger probability of you starving to death if you just stay here, so as a result you leave. And so disadvantages are creating other scenarios where people are weighing probability versus magnitude. So within a disadvantage, there are a couple of things that you need to prove. There is a quiz question, is what are the 3 points to disadvantage? The 3 parts of a disadvantage. The first part is uniqueness. And that's arguments or evidence that shows that the disadvantage is not already happening. So for instance, in that trade-off just said where student loan debt was going to be forgiven if you didn't spend more money enforcing the other plan, a uniqueness argument would be currently student loan debt is going to be forgiven. That's my uniqueness. Right now student loan debt is going to be forgiven. The second part is a link. Spending money on anything else will trade off with forgiving student loan debt. So right now, student loan debt will be forgiven, so it's a unique disad. But the plan, the link, shows that the affirmative causes something to happen that will stop them. You trade off because money is finite, that means student loan debt doesn't get forgiven. My link is you spend money. And then lastly, the impact. Failure to forgive student loan debt will cripple new graduates and make it so that they'll be unable to better their lives, get new homes, which will eventually cause the economy to topple in on themselves and destroy the educational system that we have ongoing right now. So that's the impact. So if I ran that trade-off disad, now I could weigh the ability to eliminate student loan debt versus banning sugary drinks in primary and secondary schools. And now the debate is which is more important to take care of, right? And so this off-case argument has taken the affirmative off of their ground, which is why it's called the off-case argument, in order for the negative side to control that ground. And so part of the debate is picking what you want to debate about. And so if you don't want to debate about why we should continue to kill dolphins in Japan, you don't have to defend Japanese killing of dolphins, you could run a disadvantage or an argument, right, for why the UN shouldn't have more power, because then they'll try and be culturally imperialist in this other instance, which would be worse than what's going on with the dolphin hunt, right? So it's not that you're saying, it doesn't always have to be a yes-no case, which is oftentimes what happens with on-case arguments, but you're bringing them to try and talk about something else. So the three parts of the disadvantage is uniqueness, link, impact. And then sometimes there's something known as an internal link, which is extra steps. So if A causes B, causes C, an internal link would add another step to it, right? So it's that failure to forgive student loan debt would hurt the economy, could be an internal link to an impact that then is hurting the economy will cause a new war. Because when economies go down, oftentimes go to war. Right? So there's sometimes more chains in the event than just A causes B. Like a trade-off they said is you spend money, you take it away from here, that's bad. That's normally a single step. The more steps that are in, the more links, internal links you have in a disad, the weaker it's going to be. Because an affirmative only has to disprove like one part of it, and then the entire chain falls apart. Right? So if you prove that there are not aliens, then my disad about going outside to kill you is not going to come true. Or if you prove that there are aliens already in this room ready to kill us, then that disad is not unique, so it doesn't matter if you're in the room or out of the room. Right? So affirmatives could disprove any part of the disadvantage. Alright, is there questions? Okay. The second type of off-case argument is what's known as a counterplan, or CP for short. A counterplan is a plan that serves as an opportunity cost to the affirmative. So it's a different idea. Right? So, for instance, there's something known as an aging counterplan. And the second resolution is that the United Nations should adopt a resolution. You could, instead of having the United Nations do it, you could have the United States should do something in order to get Japan to stop. Or you could have Japan stop. Or you could pick NATO. Or you could pick any other agent. So you could counterplan to have a different agent do the plan opposed to the United Nations. And then you give a disad for why the United Nations doing something is bad, and then arguments for why the United States doing something is a better idea. Right? So then the debate is not, should we decry the dolphin hunt, but the debate is, who should decry it? Should it be the United States or the United Nations? Right? Or should it be Germany or the United Nations? Right? We know the affirmatives have to defend the United Nations. Negatives could defend any other agent that exists out there. Alright? And that's why in the first resolution, sugary drinks should not be sold in primary and secondary schools. There is no agent in that resolution, so that means the affirmative teams in that first speech could pick states, federal government, individual schools, whatever, and then negatives could pick different agents as a response as a form of a counterplan idea, but they don't have to. But generally you use counterplans to sort of solve for the disadvantage. So if the US spending money is a bad idea doing it, have somebody else do it instead. Right? If the UN doing something is bad, have somebody else do it instead. Yeah?
So no matter what the proposition brings up in the opening, if the rebuttal is an off-case thing like that, then the proposition person forced to change their whole argument just to defend what or oppose what they just said?
To a certain extent, yes. But you also, as a proposition, you want to go back to the things that they're not answering, explaining why it's still important. Right? But if the negative side gets up there and says, we agree with everything that you said in that first speech, outside of the fact that you said the United Nations should do it, and the only thing they were disagreeing with you on was that it should be the United States opposed to the UN, right? For you to then go back and be like, the dolphin hunt is morally reprehensible, it's a waste of your time because they've already agreed to that. The only thing that they're disagreeing with is the agent, right? And so that's something, and so then it forces the affirmative to have to defend just that one part of their affirmative, right? So if you've created a good counterplan, you've done a counterplan that will solve for everything the affirmative wants to solve for, but then have that one additional benefit, which would generally be a disadvantage for why it's better than the affirmative.
Do you think can the opposition win an argument like that?
They can, and they do, a lot of times, right? Because if they say the UN, and you prove the UN is a bad actor and will never be able to take action and won't cause an end, but if the US refused to trade, then Japan will change, then, well, I'd vote for the team that actually caused the dolphin hunt to end, if they both agree that it should end. One solves, one doesn't solve. Alright. Within a counterplan, the first thing you need is a text, which is just what does your counterplan do. If you want, you could have a counterplan that has anarchy. You could say the United States should dissolve itself. Could be a counterplan. And if the United States dissolves itself, then well, we know the United States can't, enforce any ban on sugary drinks because it simply doesn't exist anymore, right? You have the United Nations dissolve itself. Go back to a world of global anarchy and stuff like that. And the affirmative side can't say anarchy is impossible because fiat exists. So then it becomes a debate about is anarchy desirable or not. So you could have counterplans that are more radical than just sort of like I'll have the U.S. versus the UN. You could say we shouldn't have governments controlling us at all. We should eliminate government and have free choice for whatever it is that we want to do and have a defense of that as well. But the bottom line is the text says exactly what your counterplan does. The next thing is that you need to prove that it's mutually exclusive. And what that means is that they can't be done at the same time together. So in my example, where I say the United Nations, like the affirmative says the United Nations should do it, and then the negative gets up here and says the United States should do it. On face, that's not mutually exclusive. The UN could do something and the United States could do something. However, it could be mutually exclusive if having the UN do something is a bad idea, the disadvantage. So they can be done together, but they shouldn't be done together. So they function as opportunity cost. So, yep.
So you just mentioned fiat. So during like your video, like if you're the opponent or whatever, do you just call them out in the middle of the video and say, well, like how do you bring that about that to the judge's attention?
Well, you'd be like, they say this is impossible.
Fiat?
However, fiat would solve that because the debate should be what should be done.
Okay.
Right, and if you want to take it a step further, you would explain why it's important that we should have the concept of fiat, because otherwise we could only debate about what's possible and not what should be done and desirable. So you could give a basis for why fiat is a good idea, because the negative side, the other team could argue that fiat is a bad way to approach debate, and could win that, and then you don't get fiat. Most people think it's a good way to approach debate because debating about whether it's going to be filibustered or going to be signed is really boring because that's just yes, no.
So like how do you use it like in like the context of like a sentence?
I'd be like, they say we can't get anarchy because it's impossible. Fiat solves this argument because debate should be about what is desirable and what should be done, not what can be done. If we win that anarchy is a desirable position, you should vote for us because we've proven that this is what you should vote for, and then I give some arguments for why it's important to affirm a stance of anarchy. Right. And so, mutually exclusive, you do have to prove that it's not desirable to do the two things together. So, you want to go to a movie, and your friend says, I don't want to go to a movie, I want to get something to eat. Right? They're mutually exclusive options. Either we eat or we go to the movie. But, if your friend says, well, we can actually eat at the movies because they now sell pizza and nachos and other things, then, well, you go to the movies and you eat there. But you could then explain also that it's unhealthy to eat at the movies because of saturated fat content, or that it's too expensive to eat at the movies, so I can't afford to go to the movies and eat at the movies, so I need to cook food at home and then we'll miss the movie. So now it's mutually exclusive again. So just because two things can be done simultaneously does not necessarily mean that it's desirable to do. Right? So when you prove that the counterplan is mutually exclusive to the affirmative, it doesn't have to be theoretically mutually exclusive. It could be mutually exclusive based upon desirability. It's not desirable to do it together. Right? So a counterplan needs to prove that that doing the counterplan alone is the best option, and not doing the affirmative or the affirmative and the counterplan. So they're proving that this is the best option. The other thing counterplan needs to do is that it needs to show net benefits. And what net benefit is just a reason for why it's better than the affirmative. Right? I say UN, you say US, your net benefit is why the UN is bad and the US is a better actor. So just why is it better? What is the benefit to doing the counterplan over the affirmative plan? Alright, so quiz question is just, what are the three parts of the counterplan? That's what they are. Yep.
Do we have to explain them or just list them?
Nope, just list them in this instance. There are two different ways you can run a counterplan. Conditionally and unconditionally. An unconditional counterplan is a counterplan that you would advocate the entire time no matter what. So that means that at the end of the debate, the judge is only determining counterplan or the plan. A conditional counterplan is one that you are not stuck advocating the counterplan. You can revert to the status quo, right? So you say movie, I say eat, but I reserve the right to say I'd rather just not go to the movie even if we're not going to eat, right? I just go for the status quo, sitting here and watching TV because that's better than the movie you want to go to, right? So a conditional counterplan, you could stop advocating at any point, or you could tell the judge at the end of the debate round, you have two choices. If you think the status quo is better or my counterplan is better, then you vote for the opposition side, opposed to just the counterplan. All right? So a lot of people be like, well, why not always run them conditionally? Because it gives me more options. And the reason why you might not always want to do that is because the affirmative team could say it's unfair, because they have to defend one thing throughout the entirety of the round. So it's fair for the negative to have to also defend one thing during the entirety of the round. But as a negative, you could say, my job is just to negate. I just have to prove a reason for why what you're doing is a bad idea. I can run 10 counter plans. If one of them is a better idea, it's a reason for why we shouldn't vote affirmative. And so you can have a debate over whether or not conditional is allowed or not allowed. Most people think that it's okay to run things conditionally now, but some people think that it's unfair and can make those arguments. So again, you can defend it or not defend it. But if you have a counter plan that you just know is a good idea, that you know you're going to want to go for at the end, just run it unconditionally because you know it's better, so why not just stick it out? Alright? Questions? There is a quiz question, or what are the two different types of ways you can run a counterplan? Conditionally and unconditionally. That quiz question is asking for a definition of each one of them. Conditionally is that you can stop advocating at any point, or you can also advocate for the status quo. Unconditionally is that under all circumstances, no matter what, you will defend the counterplan as a better idea, period. So it's just counterplan versus plan at that point. Alright? Everyone good?
You will defend the what?
The counterplan. Unconditional. Under all circumstances, that will be what you defend. You'll never revert back to the status quo or another counterplan or anything like that. Okay. Questions? Yeah.
Unconditionally is not advocating status quo.
Unconditionally is you cannot advocate the status quo for any other options.
Right.
That you're always advocating just that counterplan.
And then conditionally is that, oh, that was conditional.
That's unconditionally.
That's
Conditionally is where you could stop advocating at any point.
Oh.
That's just an argument you throw out there as like
I
something
see.
else to do, right? Your friend wants to go downtown and you're like, I have 3 other ideas of what I want to do instead. And even if you don't like any of those 3 ideas, I'm still not going downtown. I'd rather just sit on the couch, right? Unconditionally is, no, this is a really cool house party. I'm going to the house party. You should come with me. I will never say anything else because that's where I'm going. And then it's a defense of that one counter idea, right? All right. Questions? Okay. The third type of off-case argument is known as a critique, or just a K for short because debate has used the German spelling of critique. And what a critique is sort of a philosophical indictment of the affirmative. And so you could indict them for being racist, sexist, homophobic, anthropocentric, insert whatever any other ism you're interested in talking about. You could criticize their discourse, their ideology, their ontology. You could criticize any of those various different things. So if you're someone who's into philosophy and take a lot of philosophy courses or comp lit or English postmodernism courses, critiques are where a lot of your bread and butter will be because it's where a lot of those philosophical arguments exist. So for instance, if you want to run a critique about state intervention and why state power or why there's an abuse of state power when they try and control what it is that we eat, that's a critique. That's statism. You're arguing that the state should not be able to control our lives and our choices and trying to ban sugary drinks in schools or ban tobacco. Like those are reasons of why it's violating individual rights. So it's a individual type thing. Another critique that exists is where you could critique their language. So if somebody keeps saying he said this, he said that, and you're not a he and you happen to be a she, you could say they should lose the round for gender essentializing and assuming that he is a universal pronoun and that it is more important for them to lose because of this offensive way that they've referenced me as a female than talking about what they're talking about. And if you could win that discourse is worse than what the affirmative is advocating for, you can win the debate round on a question of discourse. So if you remember the issue of Fiat, what happens after you assume the plan passes? A lot of times critiques are known as pre-Fiat, and that means sort of what's happening before we're even debating about the idea of what the affirmative is advocating about. And so a discourse criticism is not that the plan is a bad idea, what the affirmative is advocating is a bad idea, but the way that they framed it and phrased it was a bad idea. Alright? And so you all, obviously know that Fiat isn't actually real, right? When the judge votes for you, obviously the plan doesn't actually pass. It's just someone clicked a button and clicked submit. Right? So it doesn't actually pass. So the logic of the critique is that even if your plan might be able to solve for 100% of your harms in this imaginary world, it's better for us to talk about what's happening within the educational space that's ongoing within this round than this imaginary world that exists, because that's real. So if the judge votes against someone for saying he as a universal pronoun, and that person gets really upset because they're like, what the fuck, come on, he just means everyone, it's just everyone, that's what he means. Man means human, right? And then they talk to their friends about that, and their friends are like, yeah, that's crazy, I can't believe it, but they're talking about it. And so even if there's a 0.0001% chance that someone's going to stop using that language, that's more than what happens in an imaginary world of 100%, because it's all imaginary versus being in the real world, right? And when the Constitution said stuff like all men are created equal, that was literally used as a reason for why women were not equal, because man and men were not all of humanity. And so if someone's criticizing you for that language, you have to defend that language, or defend that language doesn't matter and that it's more important to pay attention to what it is that you're advocating for. But if you could win that saying something like that is a reason for why they should be rejected, they can. Same thing if someone happens to use vulgarity. If someone says fuck, there's a lot of literature out there for why that word is a bad word to use because of its patriarchal and heteronormative connotations, and you could cause someone to lose as a result of saying that word. There's also a lot of literature out there saying that it's good and it's empowering, and so there's a debate that could take place over that as well. Yeah?
Oh, well, since you're, what is the standard as far as like profanity is concerned?
Up to you.
Okay.
It's up to you. Look at the judge. Some judges will care a lot, some judges won't care at all. Like when someone uses profanity and I'm judging around, I really don't care. Sometimes people just, sprinkle fuck or like shit after every single word, and then it loses any sort of impact, and then it's like, that's just bad. You're just a bad speaker for doing that. But sometimes, when people use it at a couple of key points, like when they're riled up or someone said something really offensive and you're like, no, that's fucked up, and you say it, that could resonate with judges. Other judges are like, shouldn't ever be able to utilize this language, so it's, look at your judges, and I would say do what you're comfortable with, but then also recognize that you are participating in sort of like a collegiate activity simultaneously, right? So you don't want to, if you're, someone who consistently swears all the time, you might not want to swear that much, but if you do it, at some points, it's normally not so bad, So a judge will probably not vote against you for it, but they might lower your speaker points for it. But the other team could also say that you should lose for it too, and then you'll have to defend it. And do you really want to have the debate be about whether or not you said shit and we should say shit online or not, right? Because you could be stuck suddenly defending that. If somebody runs a critique of me saying he, right now, everything that I said in my first speech is irrelevant, because the only thing they disagree with me on is the language of he. And there's really not a lot of literature out there saying we should say he or man as a universal, but now I'm stuck defending this. Which is why in the debate community, most people have started to either say sick or cross it out or just say one or other things, because they just it was not worth their time defending that discursive choice, and they've changed as a result of that, right? And you might be like, well, it's a waste of time changing, but you realize that that's something that you then have to defend. So it's one of those things where, what is debatable and how, is one of those things that anything can be debatable based on your ability to sell that argument. Alright, so within a critique, same deal. You have to prove the link, that they actually said he, that they actually said fuck, that they actually were specious, racist, sexist, homophobic, etc. So, speciesism criticism, which is a criticism of privileging human species over other species, would say against the dolphin hunt one, a lot of people will say that we should stop the dolphin hunt because it kills biodiversity, and biodiversity is essential to make sure that human life on Earth can continue to exist. That's specious because the only reason why they think killing dolphins is bad is because it'll eventually hurt humans. So there's no intrinsic worth to the dolphins outside of what it gives to humans. And so my link would be, see the way they talk about biodiversity is privileging humans over the dolphins. So even if their plan might be good for the dolphins, the ideology that they have behind it is a bad one that you should vote against. right? And so people will use that argument on the negative side a lot this year because I don't know how many people are going to defend dolphin hunt being good. We've got some entries from Singapore. There's going to be some Japanese programs that are entering, so they might defend dolphin hunt being good. But I think a lot of people attack the agent or other ways of going about doing it, where you're saying that we should end the dolphin hunt only re-solidifies human domination over the world. And then that will cause other species forms of violence. And then you need an impact. Why is racism, sexism, homophobia, speciesism, etc., why are those things bad, right? And so a lot of them, right, like racism. People think racism is bad. But you can't just be, like, what they've done has upheld racism and is therefore racist. You have to weigh racism against the impact of sugary drinks, against ADHD, obesity, any of those other impacts that they talk about. So you want to be able to explain how racism is more important in this instance to challenge than what the affirmative is talking about. So again, you need to compare, just like in the dissent, the impact versus the harm. Does the impact outweigh the harm? If it does, then you win the round. If it doesn't, then it doesn't. Right? So you need to win. And that he is universal language. I have to win that sexist discourse is bad enough that it's worth voting on despite what they've said in the beginning. Alright. And the other thing that a critique has is a solvency or an alternative. And what a solvency or alternative is that explanation of why voting negative would actually do something. Like rejecting them from saying he will be able to re-educate them because only through losses will people begin to change their language. Then shows the judge if they vote for you on the negative side, it actually can do something in the real world. If I reject racism, every time we reject racism, every time we reject sexism, it puts us in a step in the right direction, is a solvency claim. So the alternative is reject racism in each instance. This is one of those instances. By doing that, we can help be able to topple the way that white supremacy operates. Things like that. Alright, what are the 3 steps to the critique? That's what they are. Questions? Okay. The last type of off-case argument is a procedural argument. And what a procedural argument is essentially a rule or something that the affirmative team has done that's unfair. So, in the online tournament, people are allowed 30 seconds of leeway. But very often, people's videos will be like 4:35. You can make a procedural argument for why they should lose the debate round because they went 5 seconds over the 30-second leeway, and that should be a reason for why they should lose, even if everything they said was good, because it's unfair, bad for education, and means that we're just going to continuously post longer and longer videos until we have hour-long videos. Right? So you can run a procedural argument for why what they've done is unfair within a debate round. Alright? Within a procedural argument, the first thing you have is an interpretation. What's the rule? The rule says 4 minutes for your first speech, 30 seconds maximum leeway time. That's the rule. That's what we should have. The interpretation of what it should look like. So for instance, if somebody said, we shouldn't have sugary drinks in college, that they shouldn't be sold on college campuses. My interpretation would be, primary and secondary education are not college campuses. Here's a definition of what a primary school is, here's a definition of what a secondary school is, not undergraduate campuses. So I give an interpretation of what the round should look like. Then I give a violation. They went for 4 minutes and 35 seconds. That's 5 seconds over the maximum amount of time. They say undergraduate colleges and not K through 12. My violation. So how does the team not meet the rule that you have spelled out? Right? This is the rule, this is how they violated the rule. The next thing you have is standards. And those are reasons for why your rule is a good idea. Normally it comes down to like education or fairness. Right? If you're not debating about sugar drinks or the dolphin hunt, you're debating about giving the land back to Native Americans, we can't have clash, which is unfair because I don't have the time to be prepared for that debate, which means at best we're going to have just very surface level debates over these issues, which means that it's also hurting the education. So what is your rule meant to uphold? Education, fairness, the ability for us to get contextualized education to the resolution, or the ability for us to become good advocates, anything along those lines. So there's any number of standards that exist. Once you allow for 5 seconds, then the next thing people are going to be posting 10-minute videos, and then half-an-hour videos, and then debates will never end because these are going to go on for so long. We've agreed to these time limits, not other time limits. So you create a standard for why your rule is a good rule. And the last thing is voters. Why is it worth voting on this issue? So, they went 5 seconds over. It's important to reject them to set a community precedent against people going longer. Otherwise, it'd be bad for education and fairness, and that will hurt the equity. So, it's a reason to reject them as a result of it. Them advocating for giving the lands back to Native Americans was so unfair and so bad for education, the game should just stop being played and they should just lose as a result for it. And why should that take place is you explain why it's important for the judge, as a judge, to be an adjudicator to make sure that the debate round is fair and educational before evaluating the merits of the argument. So you explain why your standards are worth voting on. For instance, if somebody goes 5 seconds over, you might not want to have a voter that says they should lose a round because of it. You might say, as a result, you should give me 20 extra seconds to not only make up for the time that they took that was extra, but also as a punishment for them to have going over. So your voting issues don't always have to be they lose a round, but could also be something to make up for it being unfair. Right? So you can ask for different ways that the judge could vote on it based upon criteria you outline. Right? If you play Monopoly with a little kid, like, you know, when I play Monopoly with my daughter, if she takes another $500 bill, she's cheating. I probably could still beat her. So it's probably not worth ending the game and saying you've cheated, so therefore the game's over. I could probably just continue to play the game and it'd be fine. But maybe it wouldn't be if she took Boardwalk and Park Place and 2 hotels. So maybe in response to that, I'll do some, you know, shiesty math with money during the course of the game in order to even the odds or something along those lines. But essentially you need to prove that the violation was so bad that they should lose the game as a result of that in terms of the voting issues. And sometimes it might be, sometimes it might not be. Like if she took Boardwalk and Park Place and 2 hotels, I'd probably say you can't do that, you know, we're starting the game over again. Versus if you just took an extra $500 bill, that might actually make the game more fair because she's little, she's like 6, so she deserves some more money. So procedural arguments are meant to set up fairness and education within the debate round. So again, quiz question, what are the steps of procedural argument? That's what the steps are. You don't have to define the steps for any of them. The other quiz question is what are the 4 types of off-case arguments? And those ones you have to name the 4 types of off-case arguments: dissent, counterplan, critique, and procedural, with like a sentence definition of what each one of those are. Okay, steps you don't need to define, conditional and unconditional you do need to define, fiat you need to define, shits you need to define. Yeah?
Can I just get a summary of like what a critique is, or like a sentence?
Yeah, a critique is a philosophical reason to reject the affirmative team. So it's an indictment of them. So it criticizes their ideology, their ontology, their epistemology, their discourse, indicts them for being racist, sexist, homophobic. So it's not A causes B causes C, but that they've done something problematic based upon the assumptions that they have used to build up and create that initial affirmative. Alright? Yeah?
Can I get the same sentence for a procedural argument?
Procedural argument is a creation of the rules of how the game should be played. Showing that the affirmative team is cheating or have done something that is unfair or bad for education.
Can you just explain standards one more time?
Standards?
Yeah.
Standards are the reasons for why your rule is a good one. Right, so you can come up with any number of reasons for why your rule is a good rule. And then it's different than voters, even though they're related, because your voters are reasons for why your rule is not only good, but why it's worth pulling the trigger for the round to be deciding that way. Alright, and in all these instances on the affirmative side, you only need to disprove one of the steps to not lose on that argument. If I could prove that I didn't violate your procedural argument, I don't lose. Or if I could prove that I shouldn't lose the game for it, I don't lose. You only have to divide, take out one of the steps. Other questions?
What did you say the 4 ways were?
Oh, the 4 different off-case arguments?
Right.
Dissad, counterplan, critique, procedural. Alright. Everyone good?
What was
text under Counterplan?
Text is what your counterplan does. Just like a statement. We advocate dissolving the government. We advocate the United States being the agent who enforces the plan. Just exactly what you're going to do. In the same way that an affirmative will say how they affirm the resolution, you say how it is that what you're advocating against that.
I understand Fiat, I'm just very unsure how to word it. For like a sentence on the quiz, you would say something like, literally like, we wanna debate something desirable or something that should be and not something that's impossible.
I would accept that. The sentence that I would say is that the belief that if the judge votes affirmative, that it actually happens. Right, so the belief that if the judge votes proposition, whatever they said went into effect. Right, and you explained the reason for why that's the case, which lets me know that you at least know what it's being used for, but what it is just the belief that it comes into existence. Right?
For the
Yeah.
quiz, we need to know each of the steps for example, procedural, but not define them.
Right.
Okay.
So it'll be like, what are the 3 parts of the dissed, and then extra credit will be what's the 4th thing I put up on the board, which was internal link. But you don't need definitions for it. You do need definitions for each of the off case, each of the shits, unconditional, conditional, and fiat. Yeah?
Could you explain the procedural part? I only got the part about the creation of rules that is correct.
Yeah, and the procedural argument is essentially creating a rule that for how the debate should be able to should take place, and that the affirmative team violates that and should be rejected as a result of it. Alright. Any other questions? No? Okay, so all of that is what is on the quiz